Hi, I'm Michelle Stirling, and I'd like to thank the FreedomTalk organizers, John Robson, Danny Hozak, and their whole team for inviting me to speak with you today. This is coming to you from a virtual location, so I hope that the presentation will be sufficient for the participants, and please feel free to ask me questions. I'll leave an email at the end. You can send in your questions if you have any. So I'd like to address the issue of carbon tax to stop a climate emergency. Is that science or science fiction? Now, about this presentation, as most of you know, I work with Friends of Science Society as the communications manager, but today's presentation is not a Friends of Science presentation. It's my personal presentation and views, and I may be drawing on some information that I've gleaned over the years working with Friends of Science, but I represent only myself and my views. So let's have a look at the mandate of Canada's Climate Change and Environment Minister, Jonathan Wilkonson. So in the most recent mandate letter, which was from January the 15th of 2021, there's a few things that we should highlight. To be ready for what lies ahead, our government must continue to be agile and use the best available science and evidence. And that's because Canadians are counting on us to ensure that today's policies, programs, and services are calibrated and targeted to meet their needs. Another part of that same letter says we remain committed to evidence-based decision-making that takes into consideration all the impacts of policies on all Canadians. And in a previous mandate letter of 2019 in December, it says, I also expect us to continue to raise the bar on openness, effectiveness, and transparency in government. This means that government is open by default. It means better digital capacity, and it means a strong, resilient public service. It also means humility and continuing to acknowledge mistakes when we make them. Canadians do not expect us to be perfect. They expect us to be diligent, honest, open, and sincere in our efforts to serve the public interest. So that's kind of the pivotal point around which my talk will focus today. Now, what if a government's science is out of date or skewed? What if the economic assumptions of carbon taxes are off? What happens when science relies on a singular theory with no public debate or cost-benefit analysis of the proposed objectives? And what if countries even manage to meet their Paris Agreement targets? If all countries met their targets by 2030, the resulting reduction in warming by 2100 would be 0.05 degrees Celsius. And if they continued meeting their targets by 2100, there would be 0.17 degrees Celsius reduction in warming. So that's 17/100ths of a degree Celsius in warming. That's immeasurable. And the cost for doing this would be $1 to $2 trillion a year. Now, I didn't do this math. It was done by Bjorn Lomborg. I recommend that you read his book, False Alarm, because it goes through all of these details. So you might ask yourself, well, then why do governments pursue such an obviously ineffective and very expensive goal? The Climate World reference point is this RCP 8.5 scenario, Representative Concentration Pathway 8.5. It's the most extreme scenario, it's the least likely, and it's based on hopelessly outdated science. And we're not on that catastrophic pathway. But it just keeps proliferating throughout all of academia and climate science. Now, has this ever happened before on this scale? Well, yes. Here's an historical example of science gone wrong. It's called polywater. Maybe some of you remember it from the 60s. There was a substance called polywater. It seized the imagination of the public. People thought, whoa, new water, it doesn't freeze. And engineers were speculating about, well, maybe we can use it like antifreeze or anti-corrosive agent. But some scientists worried about the possibility that it could escape the lab and proliferate and seed more polywater on its own. And here's another example. This is a historical example from medical research. A 2015 literature review found almost 900 peer-reviewed studies published on breast cancer used a cell line that was derived from a breast cancer patient in Texas in 1976. But in 2007, it was confirmed that that cell line was actually a skin cancer cell line. So a cursory search of Google Scholar indicates the studies continue to be published mistakenly up until 2020 using the skin cell line in breast cancer research. So imagine, like, all that research basically had to be sidelined because it was based on a fundamental error. So if we look at the climate world, this is a similar thing. The RCP 8.5 scenario is the least likely scenario. It's proliferated in science papers, and actually these two green billionaires, Thomas Steyer and Michael Bloomberg, according to Roger Pielke's work, have put together a thing called Risky Business back in about 2014. And this report, Risky Business, became an integral part of the finance community's view of climate. And it used this RCP 8.5, which does look on the graph like a very catastrophic scenario. But that's not what's going to happen. These RCP 8.5 scenarios proliferated, even though it's not business as usual, it became known as that. People often would say, well, if we keep using fossil fuels like this, and they'd always point to that graph, then this business as usual scenario, then we'll have a catastrophe. But it's not business as usual. So Roger Pielke Jr., who's been a climate policy analyst for many years, his father is a climate scientist who does great work on human impacts on land and water use. Pielke Jr. and Justin Ritchie out of BC, in their literature review, found that almost 17,000 peer-reviewed articles use that now outdated highest emissions scenario. And this scenario is by far the most commonly cited one by the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the US National Climate Assessment. And every day there's still new studies being published using RCP 8.5 as the premise. One of the most interesting things of the Pielke and Ritchie work is that they found that peak carbon dioxide emissions were probably reached in 2019. So that means that we actually don't have to engage in net zero 2050. We don't have to do these extreme climate policies that will turn the world upside down and try and convert everything to electricity in the space of 9 or 10 years, push electric cars everywhere, stop using fossil fuel ICE cars. No, we're not at a catastrophic point whatsoever, because we have, according to their research, already reached the peak of carbon dioxide emissions in 2019, and since we had COVID all last year, we probably have reduced our emissions considerably, and probably the recovery will be slow off the mark as well. And the problem too is that many commentators or scientists tend to compare these pathways. So they'll say, well, here is the 8.5 scenario, business as usual, but if we only followed the 4.5 scenario, then emissions would come down. But first of all, the 4.5 scenario has 3 billion fewer people in the scenario. So, hopefully people are not thinking, oh, well, we should then depopulate the planet. I mean, I know there are some people in favor of that, but that should not be the conclusion drawn, because these RCP scenarios were never ever meant to be prescriptive for policy. They were meant to be examples for scientists who were researching the effects of what forcings had most effect on the scenario's outcomes. They were never meant to be policy making devices. And so, you know, we can't compare these scenarios because the assumptions are all different throughout all of them. And yet, in most major government publications, you'll find these RCP scenarios being compared one to another, and typically promoting the 2.6 as the lower emission pathway, as if that's a choice. And in fact, I think you'll find that throughout the work of, Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, in many of their publications, and of course they're often citing Environment Canada. You'll find this repeating comparison of these pathways. These are not choices. These are not prescriptive pathways at all. And even high-profile climate scientists like Dr. Catherine Hayhoe incorrectly compare these scenarios. So Dr. Hayhoe and her colleague Ann Stoner are the authors of Alberta's Climate Future Report, and it recycles these RCP comparisons from the Environment Canada report. So you see how it's almost like the telephone game, you know, where you start here and a broken telephone, but it just keeps going around and around, and the science gets more and more corrupted the more that these are used, and the economics get more and more corrupted. So just to be sure, let's look at what the authors of the RCP study said. This is Van Vuren et al. 2011. They said that the RCPs should not be interpreted as forecasts or absolute bounds, nor should they be seen as policy prescriptive. The RCPs describe a set of possible events in emissions and land use based on consistent scenarios representative in current literature, but they should not be interpreted as boundaries for possible development with respect to emissions and land use, and they're not meant to be policy prescriptive. But that's how they're being used, unfortunately. So, as I mentioned earlier, it is deeply concerning that some parties might misinterpret the population scenarios as suggesting that depopulation is necessary or desirable to meet a climate target. So the RCP 8.5 differs from the other scenarios in that there are 3 billion fewer people factored into the lower emission scenarios. And it's also very deeply concerning, especially to me, that powerful figures like the Davos WEF group, you know, World Economic Forum, Bill Gates, Boris Johnson's father, the Club of Rome, well, his father's passed away now, but he wrote about this, Club of Rome, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, or PICS, they all promote limits on population, and possibly from mistaken interpretation of these scenarios, or perhaps they just are Malthusian thinkers. Now, if we look at Bloomberg Green, says the world is moving toward a net zero target because of a single sentence. So, is that how science is done? All based on the least likely scenarios? So, a single sentence in the IPCC SR 1.5 report of 2018, is that the driver of this net zero fanaticism? Because that's not science. You've got to do a far broader evaluation of the scientific evidence than just choosing one sentence from the IPCC report. And when you look at that report, it's also full of what they call a FULU, agriculture, forestry, and other land use. So this desperate effort to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which is actually unnecessary and it's damaging because carbon dioxide is fertilizing plant growth worldwide. So that's a benefit to us. Anyway, this desperate effort that we see and hear now to stop the climate emergency with carbon taxes, removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and planting trees probably stems from the misuse of the RCP 8.5 scenario. So either the planting of trees or what they call BECCS, bioenergy carbon capture storage, will save the planet. Now, BECCS is interesting because it entails planting something like switchgrass, harvesting it, then burning it, and capturing the CO2. So why not use fossil fuels and stop wasting agricultural land? Biofuels are actually a crime against humanity. So likewise, the push for lab meat or eating bug protein over normal meat and milk products from livestock and dairy cows, these proposals are also unnecessary, and actually they're very unlikely to ever be able to scale up to meet the human demand for food. But what's the result of all of this? Mistaken science. The result is that millions of children are terrified, public policies have been turned upside down, and green cronies are capitalizing. So poor public policy has really deadly consequences, and we've seen that recently in Texas. But not only in Texas. If you look at the UK and Germany, especially the UK and Wales, thousands of elderly pensioners die every year from heat or eat poverty. Thousands of children are suffering malnutrition because their families live in heat or eat poverty, while all these rich green cronies get their renewables obligations. That's what the carbon tax credits are called there. So when faulty science becomes state policy and there's no opportunity for open civil debate, millions of people suffer and die. That's what happened in Mao's Great Leap Forward. And if you look at the language used against people who held dissenting views, it's very much the language that's used today to condemn so-called deniers. And another historical example of state-sponsored policy like this is Lysenkoism. Lysenko was a scientist, a peasant scientist, a barefoot scientist in the Soviet Union under Stalin. And he had some very crazy ideas about genetics and plants that became extremely popular, and they were wrong, and anyone who challenged him, he got them sent off to the gulag or executed. And because of his faulty science, Sam Keen speculates it's impossible to say for sure, but Trofim Lysenko probably killed more human beings than any individual scientist in history. Now, let's go back to the carbon tax for a moment. So carbon taxes never worked in Norway, and they didn't work in Zimbabwe. And if the fuel tax that you pay of more than $192 a ton, carbon tax equivalent, hasn't stopped you from driving, then how can this be effective policy? It's obviously not. This is very important. If the carbon tax means that Canada's farmers cannot afford to pay fuel, planting, harvest, grain drying, or the costs for cattle and dairy farming, who will feed you? So, unfortunately, every time I look at this scenario, I see Mao's Great Leap Forward. I see the Holodomor in the Ukraine. I see catastrophe on the way because these policies are not being properly discussed in the public forum. We don't have any cost-benefit analysis on any of them, and yet the government is plowing ahead with them, and it's all based, as I showed you, on faulty science. So what can we learn from this history? Well, the recipe for Lysenkoism is simple enough. It requires a political authority to interfere in science by supporting dubious scientific ideas of an individual or a group of individuals, and to do so without correcting the situation, even in the face of radical contradiction with reality. So, since we reached peak carbon emissions in 2019, extreme climate policies are unnecessary, burdensome carbon taxes are ineffective, and there's no climate emergency. So if we go back to the Environment Minister's mandate letter, his mandate is to use the best available science and to consider the impacts of policy on all Canadians. So it's time for a thorough review of present climate policy and a rejection of those policies that will damage the economy, and especially the policies that hurt food production and the rhetoric that harms the mental health of children. As public discussion is frequently blocked by name-calling, calling people climate deniers, it's ever more important that we respect and demand open civil debate and full cost-benefit analysis of proposed climate policies. As I said, this presentation is my own, but I do refer you to these two recent presentations by Friends of Science Society. And I want to close reading this rather long passage by Amartya Sen, who is a Nobel Prize winner for economics, from his 1999 Democracy as Universal Value. In the terrible history of famines of the world, no substantial famine has ever occurred in any independent and democratic country with a relatively free press. We cannot find exceptions to this rule, no matter where we look. The recent famines of Ethiopia, Somalia, or other dictatorial regimes, famines in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, China's 1958 to 61 famine with the failure of the Great Leap Forward, or earlier still, the famines in Ireland or India under alien rule. China, though it was in many ways doing much better economically than India, still managed, unlike India, to have a famine, and indeed the largest recorded famine in world history. Nearly 30 million people died in the famine of 1958 to 61, while faulty governmental policies went uncorrected for 3 years. The policies went uncriticized because there was no opposition party in parliament, no free press, and no multi-party elections. Indeed, it is precisely this lack of challenge that allowed the deeply defective policies to continue, even though they were killing millions of people every year. So that's kind of a grim note to end on, perhaps, but that is a possible outcome. And it's hard to believe that that could happen in Canada, but I think you only have to look at Venezuela and see what happened there. It was a thriving country, democratic, the largest oil reserves in the world. Everything was going great. Then the power grid started to fail. And partly because of renewables, partly because they hadn't maintained their conventional supply, and gradually the economy fell apart. So now people live hand to mouth there. They're in desperate straits. So yes, it could happen here, could happen anywhere. So we need free press, we need open civil debate, we need full cost-benefit analysis, and we need to have courage to stand up and demand these things from our government, from our leaders, and to be leaders ourselves in demanding this. So I'd like to thank you very much for letting me speak to you today. If you like the kind of work that I do, you could support me on Patreon, or you can like our videos, subscribe, share any of the work that I do, or any of the work that I do with Friends of Science. I thank you very much for your time, and thank heavens for Freedom Talk. You're doing exactly what I say. You're demanding cost-benefit analysis and open civil debate. Thank you.